hear him. So while we wait for the audio to be properly set up, welcome everyone to this book reading and discussion with Luke Pepera. In case you are interested in his book, in case the title of the book interests you, there are copies available at the Vidya stand. It's just behind you there. You can pick one up there, or you can pick one up on Amazon.com or Audible, if you'd rather go that way. I'll prefer you get a physical copy because it's a very, very interesting book. Luke, can you be heard? Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, Luke, can you speak? Yeah, he's speaking, and Luke, he's not muted. Hello, Luke. Can we try again?
Hello?
Ah, nice. I thought I heard him. Hello, Luke, and good afternoon from Accra. Hello, Luke. Can you speak again? Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, just about. Not mega well. My apologies.
Okay. Now you're a little too loud for them.
Yeah, you might need to speak a little bit louder for me just because of the connection.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You're so soft-spoken and gentle. It's
I
good.
was pretending, actually. Hello, Luke. Good
Hey,
afternoon. Is this better?
hey. Yes, that's a bit. Yeah, that's better. That's better. Thank you. Thanks, Jesse.
Wonderful. Is everything okay on the bench?
Is everything okay?
Oh, we can go. Okay. Is the live stream on? Nice. Okay. James has given us the go-ahead, so we will begin. Once again, good afternoon to every one of you. Welcome to this reading and discussion with Luke Pepera. My name is Jesse Johnson. I'm a huge fan of history, like every one of you here. And depending on how far back you want to go, I'm an African, like every one of you here. Now, I'm so excited to be speaking with Luke Pepera about his debut book, Motherland, A Journey Through 500,000 Years of African Culture and Identity. That was published this year in January. If you want a copy, like I mentioned earlier, you can get a copy at Vidya or on Amazon. Just a little bit about Luke. So Luke is a historian and anthropologist who specializes in African history. He was born in Ghana, and in spite of, or perhaps because of that fact, his concerns have remained rooted in the continent. Now, he's widely read and widely consulted on all things African history, and like I mentioned earlier, this is his debut book that we will be speaking about. Luke, are you there?
Yes. Hello.
Wonderful.
I'm here.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so To get things started, I would like to ask Luke to introduce himself. Just give us a bit about his background, his career journey, his interests, and how everything has culminated first in the book and in this very moment we're about to share together. So, Luke, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Jesse, and it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be speaking on a Ghanaian stage and to a Ghanaian audience. So thank you. So I'm Luke. I'm a historian. I'm an anthropologist. I'm a writer and a broadcaster. And I s- yes. Oh, sorry. Okay. And I specialize in the history of Africa, specifically ancient and medieval African history. So I was born in Ghana. I was born in Accra, growing up in Accra, I'd always had this idea, this just growing up, I'd always seen and felt a deep history, deep and rich and varied history all around me. But when I went to the UK and I ended up going to school, do some schooling in the UK, I noticed that every time people were talking about Africa and talk about African history, the only things that they would really talk about related to that history would be slavery and colonialism. These events that encompass the last 300 years of our history, very impactful events, very important events for us to talk about. But for me, and especially being cognizant of all the history and all the culture that was around me in Ghana, I understood that it wasn't the either the be all and end all or the full scope of African history and African culture. So it encouraged me to to look further, to study further. I ended up then going to do and it sparked my curiosity in what came before. So I ended up studying archaeology and anthropology at university, where I did this module on ancient and medieval African history, and there I was sort of exposed a little bit more to some of the extraordinary achievements that of Africans, especially in these eras. Some of the great empires that existed across the continent, in the ancient world and also in the medieval world. So, from ancient Nubia, the civilizations of what's now Sudan, that had existed from 7,000 years ago up until about the fourth century of our era, so about just under 2,000 years ago. The Mali Empire, that 600 years ago, that existed in all across Mali, what's now the country of Mali, what was happening in East Africa and Zimbabwe. The exposure to that knowledge of history really inspired me. I said, there's so much here that we don't know and we don't talk about, but is necessary for us to know, and is also would give people a more accurate view of African history, African culture, and African peoples even more generally. So that provided the catalyst for my research into this period, and actually the culmination of that interest and that research is Motherland, is the book that is that was published in January that I produced. The book is made up of 10 chapters, each of which discusses and goes into a different element of African identity beyond the last 300 years of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. So I look at the importance of the ancestors to to many African cultures. I look at international trade, and I look at West African empires. I look at the importance of women and female-led societies, and depending on the theme and depending on the theme and in the chapter, I focus on a different part of Africa at a different time. So, for example, with the international trade, I look at the Swahili, who 500 years ago were trading with Iran, and were trading with India, and trading with China, and some people even from Mogadishu, or from Somalia and from Kenya, who traveled to to these places, and were trading directly with them, and in order to make these stories more intelligible and more impactful for readers, I also mix in some contemporary tales which show in a lot of ways how this history, how ideas of these identity elements are still relevant to us today.
Oh, okay. So one thing that strikes me about
Yeah.
you is just how steeped you are in history in general and African history. Now,
Mm.
right off the bat, before we get into the book proper, I'd like to know this. Based on who you are and your appreciation of history, how much historical awareness and appreciation do you find amongst contemporary Africans and
Mm.
people of African descent? And
Mm.
do you even care about that? Does it
Mm.
satisfy you or does it bother you?
Yeah. I mean, I did write, for me, I really had two audiences in mind for the, well, actually one major audience which was people of African descent. For this book specifically, I thought it would resonate more with people actually who lived in the diaspora and wanted to, and sometimes want to feel that greater sense of connection to Africa, connection to the continent. Obviously, if you were born in Africa, let's say in Ghana, you grew up there, or you live there, that sense of connection is not as urgent. For a long time, and I think especially in the mid 20th century, coming up to especially the 2000s, a little bit into our era, there really wasn't well, there was that interest, I think, in the history, but really from a political standpoint, that we were breaking free from the former colonial powers. We had to find our own path, and part of finding that own path was understanding our own history. But I think for most Africans and for most ordinary Africans, survival was at the front, the front of our minds, really. Very basic things, jobs, family, etc. And there wasn't as much interest, engagement, and passion for history. But actually, I see that changing. I see that really changing now, especially and I think the further we get from the colonial period, the post-colonial period, the more pronounced that interest in the history is becoming. We want to explore it not only in non-fiction and history books to understand the real history, to get a greater sense of who we are, but more importantly, who we were before the disruption of the last 300 years. Which I think is important to us now. But also a sense of what's become our main interest. What are we engaged in now? Before, when I was growing up, we used to consume a lot of stories from overseas, and got a greater exposure to American culture, mostly American culture. But now there's a greater appreciation and interest and value in let's say Ghanaian culture. I think the cultures of Africa more generally, but in Ghanaian culture, that is something that we can be proud of. That is something that we can also promote. Whereas I think historically there was this sense that West was best. That the less African you were and the more Western you are, the better off the better off you are, the better off you would be, the better off you would be seen. But I think as that attitude is changing, the further we get from that period, that there is an increasing appreciation of people wanting to know in order to get a sense of for us to get a better sense of our own identities.
Okay, I like that you dropped certain hints in your answer because that allows me to follow up with this next question. Um, now, do you think it's fair to say that a lot of the history of sub-Saharan Africa is filtered through an Arab and a European lens, seeing how there was a lot of Arabic influence during our medieval period, and like you mentioned, in the last 300 years, there's been a European incursion. Do you think that is true? That our sense of history has been filtered through those two foreign lenses, and just how much of pre-Arab, pre-European, sub-Saharan Africa can we know in its own voice? Do you think that even matters?
That's a great question, because I think even when I'm thinking about how I'm writing my own, the history even in my book, I appreciate and I know that I use a lot of tools from Western history which by definition would westernize that approach. So, for example, even phrases like ancient and medieval are Western Eurocentric tools to understand history. They are oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. They are tools from to understand. For they were basically created so that they're part of a Western timeline. So, for example, the ancient period ends with the fall of Rome, specifically, very specifically. And the medieval period exists after that up until the Renaissance, which happened primarily in Italy in the 16th and 17th centuries. So I understand these timelines and time frames are tied specifically to Western history, but I think there's a sense also of not as it were, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They're actually very useful for just giving people an understanding of a timeline and of when things are happening, no matter the period that you're looking at. I mean, the Arabs have a different calendar, the Chinese have a different calendar, but for historians and people who are writing history, and especially writing history in English, those are useful. At the same time, I think that one of the issues actually came about what I said there, writing in English. I mean, there aren't as many histories written, that keeping and maintaining our own languages, indigenous languages, writing in those languages, I think is important and something that could be developed more. A lot of great literature on Africa, historical literature, is written in the colonial languages. And I think when you're trying to translate ancient old sources and old sources knowledge into those languages, a lot is lost. Another thing also is the perspective. What in Europe or even as you mentioned in the Arab cases, a lot of what they write is obviously filtered through their own idea, through their own values, what's important to them in culture, which doesn't always align with Africa as well. I wanted to bring out more of those things in my book. So I'd say my book is sort of a hybrid. I talk about things from an African perspective as much as I can, things that I feel are important to African identity, African culture. I also use these other tools, whether it's the timeline from Europe or, which is also very important, the material and information, the writings of Arab writers who traveled all around Africa, but more specifically, the places in Africa that were Muslim and that were part of this wider Muslim world, wider Muslim community. There are tons of Arab writers, especially in the medieval period. So, 500, about 500 to 1,000 years ago, who traveled all around Africa and make note of what they saw, and their information is really useful because it's something also to fill out our information and our knowledge of a place. But you also have to make sure that you're putting that, that you're analyzing that alongside oral histories, African oral traditions. You're looking at archaeology, you're looking at architecture too. But I think that the important thing is really to use the tools from other places because they're useful in giving us a sense of our history. But as much as one can, to consider first and foremost the African perspective and what's important to African culture and African identity. And then once you have that foundation, I think that you write something that constitutes very much an African history, even though you're using some of these other.
Wonderful. Okay, so since this is a book reading and it's about a specific book, I'm sure you'd all want to actually listen to the words from the book, some words from the book by the author himself. So, Luke, if you will, can you give us a short reading from
Okay.
a section of the book?
Okay, yes, I would love to. Thank you so much, Jesse. So, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to stress in my book were the achievements of Africans and not even just achievement, just what was happening in Africa prior to European contact. So much of African history is seen through seen through the lens and the perspective of Europeans in Africa or Africans in Europe, even though so much was happening before that. And one of the most extraordinary things was that Africa was home to some of the first universities in the world. including the University of Timbuktu, which was founded in the early 14th century in Mali. So this reading is a description of the University of Timbuktu, the town of Timbuktu in what's now eastern Mali, and some of the things that were happening there in around the 14th, 15th centuries before any direct contact between Africa and Europe. Askia Muhammad, the ruler of the Songhai Empire, had further developed Timbuktu. Like Musa, he was devout. He also saw great value in scholars. He surrounded himself with them, asking their advice on moral and legal matters. In Timbuktu, there are many teachers, judges, imams, and other learned men who live at the emperor's expense, wrote Al-Wazan, a traveler from Morocco. Muhammad endowed the scholars' learning institutions, donating to the Sankore Mosque, an important learning center in Timbuktu, 2 gorgeous copies of the Quran. He raised Timbuktu's scholarly reputation even higher than Musa had done. Before Muhammad, Timbuktu scholars had studied mainly books that had been imported from other centers of Islamic scholarship, like Cairo. Under Muhammad, however, Timbuktu scholars began to write more of their own and export them. It's thanks largely to Muhammad that such a rich collection of books from Timbuktu exists. About 1 million have survived. They date to between the 11th and 20th centuries. They come from all over the place, from Timbuktu itself to North Africa, Iraq, and Spain. They are loose sheets of paper imported from Europe, housed in wood or leather covers. The ink with which they are written came from vegetable dyes, taken from mainly Arabic gum trees. Added to this ink were ground and burnt horns and hooves. They made the ink's colors shine more. The books are written in a variety of languages. Arabic's the main one. Some are written in the Songhai languages, others in Tamashek, an indigenous Saharan language. They're written in a variety of styles, essays, poems, letters. They cover an astonishing range of subjects: medicine, law, philosophy, grammar, calligraphy. One manuscript is a novel about the life of Alexander the Great, another an essay about the virtues of dogs. One 17th century poem about giving up earthly desires to lead a more fulfilling life reads, "Renounce this world, you'll be at ease, only a fool it seeks to please. Gather from it only the least, 'cause at the end it turns to beast." In Timbuktu, books were considered the most precious items. Owning and donating them became the most prestigious thing you could do, even more prestigious than refurbishing mosques. Timbuktu scholars were utter book lovers. When any stranger came to the city, they accosted and flattered them in the hopes that they'd give or sell them what books they had. In Timbuktu, handwritten books from North Africa are more expensive than any other article of trade, wrote Al-Wazan. Scholars amassed extensive private libraries and often lent books to one another. In the margins of many are notes and comments in different handwriting. Some are supplementary information to the main text, for instance, dates or biographical details of people mentioned in it. Others are reflections on the text's arguments. Ahmad Baba, a 16th century scholar who wrote more than 60 books on subjects ranging from historical biographies to grammar, had 1,600 books. And this was the smallest library of any of my kin, he said. Another 16th century scholar, Al-Wangari, lent his books so freely to whoever asked for them, and often forgot to get them back, that he accidentally gave away nearly his entire library. Today, arguably the largest library of Timbuktu manuscripts is Mali's Mama Hydaira Commemorative Library. It has 5,000 books dating as far back as the 16th century. Abdelkader Haidara, the founder of this library, is a descendant of Ahmad Baba. Very likely, some of Baba's own books now form part of this library. As one famous Sudanese proverb goes, salt comes from the north, gold from the south, and silver from the country of the white men. but the word of God and the treasures of wisdom are only to be found in Timbuktu.
Yeah, that's a fascinating reading because I think it's particularly interesting because usually when people talk about history, we talk about the grand political schemes of monarchs lording over thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, but then you chose to focus on books and literary tradition in Timbuktu, that famous African city. Um, what are your thoughts on the literary world of Songhai, Mali? That's part of this of Western Sudan.
You didn't quite catch that.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on the
Mm.
literary world of Western Sudan?
Oh, on Western Sudan.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's an extraordinary. I mean, obviously, Western Sudan, especially that area, especially in the medieval period, becomes quite extraordinarily, mainly because of its connection to North Africa and the Arab world via the Trans-Saharan trade, which develops from about 500 AD, so 1,500 years ago, and really continues until the 16th, 17th centuries, up until 300 years ago. But one of the consequences of that trade was that Islam comes from the Arab world and North Africa to the Western Sudan, and then immediately they're connected to this wider Muslim world and it reaches from yes the Western Sudan, but to Spain, Muslim Spain, southern Spain at this in the beginning in the seventh, eighth, ninth, eighth centuries is also Muslim, so that's connected to West Africa. Obviously, places in Western Asia now, Saudi Arabia, etc., in North Africa, and it allows for not only extraordinary movement but also different kinds of influences to come into the city, or come into the region. Sorry, and to the cities that exist there, and obviously adopting Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. These are often called religions or faiths of the book. They're closely tied with scholarship and with literature. And in fact, even though the some of the societies that existed in this region, the Western Sudan, for example, the Mali Empire, which began in the 13th century and exists until the 15th, 16th centuries, although the rulers and the traders adopted Islam, they also maintained their traditional belief systems and their traditional practices. So they perform traditional rites and ceremonies, but more importantly, they maintain this group of oral storytellers and historians, the griots, whose job it is to record the lives of emperors and then to pass these down to future emperors so they understand their history and their role in Mali society as well. So it's a society that becomes incredibly rich. The societies that exist there become incredibly rich and varied. I think they have also, because of their wealth and because of their size. I mean, Mali in its peak was had a population of 50 million people. So had a population of about now the size of the population of the UK currently 600 years ago, which is absolutely extraordinary. Was also incredibly wealthy at one point. Was producing 50% of the world's gold supply as well. Just simply one of its mines. So had an outsized influence on the region. And also on the world as well. And I think it's no accident that a lot of the great, especially medieval West African empires, originate in this region as well. And I think for the historian, who's also trying to get information about this period as well, it's these societies are absolutely invaluable.
Okay. Last question on that. Is there any evidence that original thought or intellectual innovation from that part of Africa filtered north into other parts of the world, or filtered down to like the West African coast and even below?
Mm, mm. Um, that's a great question, actually. Well, it's hard to say. I mean, there was definitely intellectual exchange between these places. We know that of the the majority of the, or a lot of the scholars, for example, who were in Timbuktu, a lot of whom were Malinke, so indigenous to Mali, they went to universities in North Africa, where they went to university in North Africa where they essentially with whom they had exchange programs. As for specific ideas, I'm not sure, but I do know that some of the there were some of the, well, actually one of the ideas that we know this actually does the spread as is actually the precursor to vaccination, so inoculation, specifically to smallpox. It's something that actually could have predated even what was happening, the 14th, 15th centuries when the University of Timbuktu existed, and when Mali was at its peak in its heyday. But the practice of inoculation had been something that is had existed, especially in, I mean, all across Africa, but it was known as well in West Africa for a long time. And it's possible that actually knowledge, so inoculation, when you're sick, when people had smallpox or got any kind of illness, they would basically either keep people in expose other people to the illness, so they built up their natural immunity, or actually find ways to transfer the illness. So, for example, via injection from one person to another, again to build up that natural immunity. And this is an idea that potentially could have spread from West Africa north and then to into Western Asia. It was something that was later on practiced by the Turks and the Ottoman Empire. And we actually know for a fact, this is later on 16th, 17th centuries, but it was actually an account, so actually specifically a Ghanaian, someone who had worked in service for an American, basically a British person in America, who had land there, and he was a doctor. This person was a doctor, and there was a smallpox, outbreak, and this Akan person basically told the doctor about the practice that they did, back in, that he knew of, where you would expose people to the illness early on, smallpox or whatever it was, and it helped build up a natural immunity, this inoculation, and the doctor starts experimenting with this and finds out that it works, and this is the first case of what is essentially vaccination happening in America. So that's one idea that did spread, and it's interesting that it's specifically someone from what's now Ghana that we can point to who actually led to this taking place and led to this spreading throughout what's now the United States.
Yeah, that's the way you explain vaccination makes it sound like folk medicine, like some wacky idea of introducing the very thing that is harming the person to help cure the person. Now, to our audience here, does anyone have a question for Luke? Oh, wow, nice. How do we do this? Do we share a mic? There's a mic approaching you. Yep, the gentleman. Nice.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Derek. My question to Luke. It's interesting you mentioned Timbuktu and their culture of literacy, and in your book. Presently, if when you say there are universities, and I mean very progressive universities in the Middle East, in the midst of all their chaos and their fights, and people will hardly believe it. I want to ask you, do you think the transatlantic slave trade in some way truncated Africa's or the kingdoms in Africa, their potential of perpetuating the civilizations that they had, that they developed? Do you think that it contributed to the truncation of their potential and in what way could some other kingdoms, in what way could some other kingdoms have taken it up to continue and evolve it into something more relevant in our even in the just the last centuries that have just passed. In what way could other kingdoms could have trampoline from your historical knowledge? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if I understand correctly, you're talking about the impact of slavery on sort of preventing these civilizations from reaching their potential. I think that.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, Jesse, was that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Double checking. Yes, great question. And in fact, it's the conventional wisdom is that it did simply because I think. Basically, the reason I think it did is that there was no Africans then didn't end up, or, a lot of these societies that were involved basically didn't end up developing other economies. And actually, I think this relates even to a wider problem. Yes, I would call it a problem maybe, that African societies generally have had for centuries, potentially millennia, and even to an extent have today, is that we have always been motivated, or we've always seen it as easier or the path of least resistance, basically to just export raw materials instead of adding value to them so that we can get more for them. So this wasn't just even the case with other Africans, with enslaved Africans, with enslaved peoples. It was also with gold. For example, we never made it into jewelry or anything. We just exported raw gold. And even sometimes the rulers of the places who were exporting this gold, they would just take a cut. They would just drop a little and then it will go. Same with ivory as well. And what's interesting to me about that is that we had the potential to make, we made extraordinary art, extraordinary architecture. So the skills and the talent was always there. But for some reason, the incentive, wasn't there. But we didn't end up doing it. And I think this was, one of the consequences of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, is that it was, it was profitable for the African kingdoms. It wasn't all of them, but for a lot of the African kingdoms who were involved in it, it was profitable, and it was also the trade that their major trading partners at the time, the Europeans, the Dutch, the Portuguese, etc., who had established plantations in the Americas, were mainly interested in as well. But I think that led basically to Africans not developing other economies, and some tried to. There's actually a letter from a king of the Kingdom of Congo, so what's now the DRC, basically, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Portuguese traders had come into his kingdom, and they're mainly trading slaves. Even people who he had invited into the king. There are other people who invited to the kingdom beyond traders, like lawyers and doctors and all this, to help him develop it. And he said, and he complains basically to the King of Portugal and to the Pope in his letter, saying even these people, they've decided to give up their professions and only trade slaves because it's the most profitable. And he says. And then he says also some of the people in my kingdom are also helping them, because this is the way that it is to make easy money, to make a quick buck, is to just be engaged in the trade. So when everybody was doing that, concentrating in that, other things didn't develop. And when other things didn't develop, the economy didn't become diversified. It relied on only one thing. So when abolition occurs, basically the main route I think, one, just trading the people, you're not developing any skills or talent either. So, your ability is becoming diminished. But when the trade is abolished, it means that then your main source of revenue is also gone as well, which led to all kinds of chaos in the kingdoms too. So I think the consequence was focusing too much on the trade as the main revenue generating opportunity is what then led to all these problems down the line. And as you said, sort of prevented the development of a lot of the kingdoms who were involved.
That's such a brilliant answer, and it's also really painful to listen to if you read the news in Ghana lately. You know what I'm talking about. One gentleman, do you have a question? So I'll take your question briefly, and then we'll move to those two ladies on the side. Are you okay?
Hello. Okay. So, my name is Victor. My question is, for Ghana, most of our history is more of like oral traditions, right? So, how difficult was it getting the history like from reliable sources? Then also the second part is, personally, what was the paradigm shift that happened for you, like after uncovering some of these history? Yes. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So other sources, well, no, as you say, the oral tradition, I think oral history hasn't been as appreciated, especially by, by a lot of historians, and especially Western historians historically as well. But I think what's great about oral history is that it gives you it can really tell you about the people more generally and culture specifically, which I think is, I mean, it's not one is better than the other because both have their pros and their cons. But I think you get a better idea of who a people are through oral history than you do through the history just of that chroniclers who were paid by, let's say, kings, etc., to write their own stories and therefore only recorded the dates and events of those particular people. You get a lot more from that. But I also do think that the historian, oral history is just one of the historian's tools. The best way to get a sense of a past is to use as many different resources as possible, and then also to analyze them together. Look at are there any, do things say, do certain sources, oral history, contradict each other? Do they say different things? Where are the bits of alignment as well? For me, I drew on some oral history, but I also drew on archaeology, on architecture. I drew on songs, or say songs as oral, but songs and stories fitting into the oral. And I drew on written documentation from people from all over the place, as many places as I could, from Morocco, Spain, China, Portugal, to get a real sense of, to get the widest sense possible and the most accurate sense possible of what was happening on the continent as well. But I think as well, when it comes to African history, the oral should be held above all the others as well. But I think the kinds of history then we tell is also going to end up looking different, which is a good thing. When you read Western histories, the emphasis, or even sometimes even Eastern histories like Chinese histories, the emphasis is always on individuals and dates. And that's mostly. Whereas with our history, especially with the oral, you can get an understanding of how a whole people understand the world, the values they have, and how they developed, which is very, very powerful for communicating a sense of identity.
Good. I had a follow-up to that, but I will let. Okay, it's. I don't know how to put this. Okay, let me just ask it plainly. No one should take offense. Okay, so first of all, do you think, not do you think, did African societies south of the Sahara lean more towards the oral or the written? And do you think that the prevalence of oral histories represents an underdevelopment of techniques of knowledge transfer within a society?
So you think, the second part is knowledge as more advanced form of...
Right. Do you think like the prevalence of oral histories within a society represents an underdevelopment of the...
Oh, okay, got you.
The mechanics of knowledge transfer?
Okay. No, not... Okay, so for the first question, I think there is... for the first part of the question, I don't think the... How do I put it? It's where there's more oral history, I don't think has anything to do with geography, really. I mean, the only way it has to do with geography depends on where was important for trade. That's the only place. So where oral history tends to be more pronounce ordinarily are in those, especially when it comes to Africa, are in those places that weren't interested or tried to maintain their traditional practices in the face of external forces or external influences. One thing that is very interesting, and this relates specifically to Ghana, is that really Islam doesn't penetrate far into Ghana. There's a reason why the entire country now isn't Muslim. There are Muslims here, but our religion, Christianity, comes a lot later, and it comes through the Atlantic, not via the trade across the Sahara with North Africa and the Arab world that I mentioned earlier. And where you see more written forms, and this is across the world actually, really. I would say across the world, because even in China, it's really to do with the world religions. The places that adopt the world religions usually developed a writing system to record their history, and that's because the world religion, you had more hierarchy, but then also just culturally, the importance of the word, knowledge, books is just a part of those religions. So, for example, Ethiopia, they have a written language, Gez, which they use to write a lot of their history and a lot of their religion. But the part of the reason they have that is that they've been Christian for 1,500 years. They're one of the earliest and oldest Christian civilizations in the world, in Ethiopia. So they developed a writing system. Mali had one as well, in East Africa too, because of Islam, and they were writing mainly in Arabic, although sometimes they spoke different languages too. But there were just other places, whether it was in Zimbabwe, whether it was in Ghana, whether it was in Angola, where they had, and in fact probably did have writing forms, but they did have writing forms. I mean, in ancient Nubia and Sudan, 800, so over 2,000 years ago, they had a script, similar to the hieroglyphs, the Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's not yet been translated, but it wasn't really the thing that they used to record their history. They used art, they used architecture, they used stories, oral stories, cosmology. It's the same thing in, I think that goes for a lot of Africa. Even if there were writing systems, it wouldn't be the thing that was used to record your history, the central tenet of your culture. As for whether it develops so I think it's more to do with that world religion element rather than geography. When it comes to representing underdevelopment, actually, no, not at all. I actually think it's the opposite. The great thing about oral history, I think a culture that has oral history understands that identity is not a fixed thing, and history is not a fixed thing. It is always changing, it is always evolving, and really understands its purpose, which is to keep people together, which is to maintain a continued and cohesive sense of one's identity. And when things happen, you need the ability to have a flexible flexible history, a flexible understanding yourselves, to make sure that people continue to be on the same page, continue to understand who they are and understand who they are in relation to each other. When you write things down, the identity becomes fixed. If you take that as your fixed identity, and that's what your identity rests on, this written documentation which is fixed. When things change, when your idea of yourself changes, and you look towards the fixed document and it doesn't reflect how things have changed, I think that's when you get an identity crisis and a cultural crisis. And actually, I think that is, in some sense, what is happening a lot in Europe at the moment. They have all these ideas about who they were, who they are, and who they were, based on what they had written about themselves. And slowly and surely, even sometimes as more written documentation is coming, but then also just as more history is coming out, just as the world is changing, just as their values are changing or have changed, their sense of themselves is changing. They look back at what they've written down and find that it doesn't match who they are now, and that is leading to emotional, philosophical crises, whereas the fluidity of a lot of African identities allows for a great deal of adaptability, which is why, and I think this is actually something, oral history is something that African peoples, African cultures developed over a long period of time. Let us not forget, we are Africans, and African societies are the oldest in the world. They date back thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Some of them are almost completely unchanged, and the reason they've managed to survive so long is because of things like this. For example, it is one technique which allows one element which allows people to be adaptable and to survive as well. So for me, it's actually it's actually a sign of an incredibly of actually almost like an over advanced society, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's such a brilliant way to look at it, that the sort of anchoring that the written word can give you could also become a harness when it's time to change. Okay.
Hi, Luke. Luke,
Hello.
I don't know if you remember me. I don't know if you can see me.
Can you see the audience? I hope you can.
Okay, never mind. I'll just introduce myself. My name is Pepera, and Luke might remember coming to play at my house with my children. I just wanted him to know when he was younger. I have a question. Over the last 2 years, there have been an incredible amount of books written about African history. Okay, from Zainab Badawi's to the brief history of African writings. There's been quite a few, right, that have focused on African history. Now, to what extent can a book such as yours, which is, I had a brief look at it, probably about 300 pages, right, try to capture the entirety of African history, of the entire continent, right, over such a long period? To what extent can it really succeed in doing justice to it? Might it not have been better to concentrate on a particular area or a particular people or a particular concept, for instance, such as Howard French's does when Born in Blackness, when he really tries to sort of look through African history from the point of view of blackness, and not just look through African history, but actually look through world history from the point of view of what came out of the African culture continent. So he's looking at it from a very specific perspective, rather than trying to tell the history of the entire continent over an entire period within 300 pages. To what extent do you think that you can successfully do that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I don't think any one book obviously can do justice to any history, to be fair. As for the concentration, I mean, my aim, my ambition was to give people an introduction to all of these different elements, and then they could go and focus on whichever element that interested them. But, I think that I wanted really just to, my aim was just to argue against this idea of African history, of the reduction of African history to the last 300 years, encompassing the slave trade and colonialism. So the counter to that was, okay, what else exists? Well, there's all of this information, all of this that we can also look at. One can dig into one, into this element or to that element. But I think if I, as in people who read the book can dig into this element or that element rather than someone. But I think that if I had focused on simply one element, I don't think I would have got across that same richness and that same depth and diversity of the entire African continent. I would have only said that I think the result would have been the argument that there is, okay, we talk about there's this element, but there's also one other thing over here, which is true, but I want to give people, there's not only one other thing over here, there are 50, 100 things here, over here, and then also, and then also and that these are things that also cut across for the most part, foundationally, the cultures and the societies of Africa, all the way almost from the beginning of our species to today. So I really wanted to get, how do I put it? Not shock is not the right word, but I really wanted to have that immediate impact. I could almost be a rush of wind, a rush of fresh air that there is just that, it's almost overwhelming that there's so much that I didn't know about the continent. Let me see which one I want to dig into. And then obviously for the references as well, there are things that people can look at if they want to get a greater sense, in the different chapters, because each one could constitute a book in itself. But if they want to get a greater sense of, which element or which identity aspect or which piece of history takes their fancy. But I think that if I had, my feeling was that if I concentrated on one, I would have widened the viewpoint of African history just a little bit, but it wouldn't have had the impact that I was going for. And one thing that it has been nice to hear as people have kind of read the book is that yes it's expansive, yes it's ambitious, but people say to me, well, I didn't know about that ancestor part. I know it wasn't that interesting. We're talking about Swahili, I just didn't realize that there was so much that was going on the continent. And I said, and sort of my response is, well, now you do. But that was kind of the response that I was looking for. So.
Excellent. Good afternoon. My name is Nana Pukia. And thank you so much for your response to the question around the importance of oral history from an African culture point of view. I think it was very insightful and for me really positive. But my question, it's almost a follow-up to the question that you've answered just now. At the beginning you talked about most of African history being written from the lens of non-Africans, Europeans, or those that have lived in Europe, Africans that have lived in Europe. So I'm just wondering, as you were writing this book, what have you seen in terms of a shift in who's narrating the African story in writing? Have you seen a shift? I mean, is there hope that stance or paradigm has actually shifted?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I do. And in fact, I think that, the real shift, I think I am seeing a shift. I'm seeing people in the diaspora as well as on the continent taking an interest in this, in the history, which I think is really one important step. I'm seeing a shift in the kinds of people who are writing about the history and deciding to tell stories about the history. There's a lot of great work, academic work, which is being done on the continent, but I think the real shift will come when hopefully we are seeing more kind of historical explorations, but for people, for non-experts in the non-academic arena, explorations of African history that are being produced in Africa, across Africa, by African historians trained at African institutions and published by African publishing houses, writers represented by African agents. So when it's all kind of happening in-house, because I think for me, I was at school and university in the UK. For me, Ghana is Ghana is home. Ghana is my background, but I can't ever get away, as it were, from. And I wouldn't want to, but the European, the English, or specifically the English culture, the English mindset is also something that is a part of me too. When I'm writing history, I'm writing in a tradition that one could argue is very much, Western. I mean, even writing history itself could be something that is said that's influenced more from the Western realm. But I have seen that. It does have benefits. It is actually positive. It's not the only thing we should do. Maintaining the oral history, maintaining the oral tradition is also part of parcel. That's also incredibly important. But it's also something we can do. And there's also, I think, things that we can learn from that Western tradition, the way that we approach history, the way we write history, and the way we think about history. I think in Africa generally, history is more of an emotional thing. It's a thing that's alive still. In the West, they make this distinction really between past and present, and the past is something, history is something to be scrutinized, to be looked at intellectually, academically. You're removed from it emotionally. It's almost like these people have no connection to you, and you're supposed to analyze, what happened and what went on. But it gives you an intelligible and a very intelligible sense, or another sense of how you came to be, what you are today. We also have that with our oral history, but it's slightly more emotional. It's slightly more social and cultural, I think, in a sense, than it is political and economic. So I think there is very much a shift because, I don't think 10, 15, 20 years ago, the books that I'm writing, or, the book that I wrote, Motherland, there's another book, Zainab Badawi, a BBC journalist who wrote, a history of Africa, an African history of Africa. There's this other book, When We Ruled, on African Queens, that is also coming out. So we're kind of teaching people about the rich, deep and varied history of Africa one beyond the last 300 years, but then, or beyond the last 300 years. But I do think that there's still a lot more that can be done, that will be done, especially as the generally African, the African book industry and writing industry becomes more developed as well. But also to tell in other ways in films and TV series. They do a little in Nigeria, tapping into the culture. They do a little bit in South Africa, but that kind of acceleration, especially historical, would be important. But I think starting as well from history, non-fiction history, so that we can get as accurate as we can a sense of who we are, but something that everybody can read and enjoy, so that we collectively understand who we are, is important. But I do think that there is a shift, because I don't think, even 10 years ago, the book that I wrote would have been out, would have been out there, and people maybe would be taking an interest in it.
A small follow-up based on to what extent do you think that our current writers, especially our writers of fiction, have a responsibility to get the historical accuracy around Africa right, particularly those who are from the subcontinent? Because there have been a number of books in the last 5 years that are historically incorrect or culturally incorrect in certain aspects, written supposedly by writers who have a connection to the continent. And I think, to what extent do we have to call this out? I don't want to history shame any book or any person. So my book club members know the ones that I take particular umbrage at. But to what extent do you think that they owe a responsibility towards getting it right?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a great question. Fiction is a tricky one, because obviously authors and then the people publishing feel like they can take this license. I think, sort of dramatic license to not totally invent, but they don't pay as much attention, as it were, sometimes, to making it as accurate as they can. I think the real antidote to that and to solving that problem is sort of history books. So that people can say, so it's like, okay, or documentaries, just anything historical that has actually tried to piece together the real history, as a kind of, to counter, as a sort of counterbalance to the fiction that exists. And I think, yes, there's that element. I think real history, but I think, calling out people who and writing about it in a way, obviously respectfully, but respectfully calling out people who haven't done the actual research. And it doesn't just, they don't have to be history buffs per se, but even just trying to go to an archive, traveling to the country, speaking to people that you can, people who haven't been who've not taken the lazy approach to writing some of these things. I think it is important to call, and the reason for that is
Luke, can you hear me?
When you're writing about something and you don't do those things, that is arguably bad fiction as well. And counts as bad fiction. So when it comes even to recommending books, if someone says, I want to learn about the history of this place, but I can't find any non-fiction books, but I found a few novels, to say, well, this one is good because the writer actually tried. They went here and they did this, etc. This one I would give it a miss, because so it could be that kind of way as well, as it were, not calling it out to the person directly, but even when we recommend books, even when we think about books, when we think about what we want to read, soliciting that advice and those opinions as well would be important, because I think, especially with Africa, because I think a lot of the Africa is probably the place with the most fictions written about, and this is has a historical precedent as well. So I think in the African case, it's particularly poignant and it's particularly important.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Actually, we're practically out of time. They're sucking us. But I will allow one question.
Hello, thank you. So my name is Claire. You touched on something that took my interest, which is the Christian faith being on the continent way before the colonizers were here. So I wanted to know if you touch upon on that in your book. And then I also wanted to know if you are aware that it goes further back than Ethiopia, but into Nubia and even from Egypt, Nubia, and that it traveled through the same trade routes that you were mentioning. Have you touched on that side of history? Maybe it doesn't interest you, but yeah, it's just that you mentioned the Christian faith being in Ethiopia prior. So I wanted to know if you were aware of the fact that it actually existed in Nubia, Egypt.
Sorry if I'm correct, you're talking about the colonial history, correct? Sorry, Jesse, do you mind?
The presence of Christianity in Africa. So
Christianity.
Yeah, you mentioned that it was in Ethiopia for, as part of their history.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you, so that interests me, and I wanted to know if you were aware of that history going further back through Nubia and Egypt, especially through the trade routes that you mentioned. I was just wondering if you're aware of that all.
Okay. Yes, I'm aware of that history. I mean, what strikes me a little bit actually about that history of Christianity and how it relates to colonialism is actually how recent it is. In a sense, it's really a 18th, but really takes hold in the 19th century, at least as far as Ghana is concerned, or Nigeria, West Africa. But when it comes to West Central Africa, the history of Christianity is there slightly earlier, especially with the Portuguese. So that's specifically Catholicism. But they, again, and actually I think we have done this in West Africa too, and in Ghana as well. It's always combined with traditional beliefs, traditional practices. I'm often always... surprise isn't the right word, but what's interesting to me is that actually, even in Ghanaian Christianity and in West African Christianity more generally, you actually see, to a certain extent, the influence of especially the traditional belief and the ancestors featuring in that history. The ancestors are people that we look for, for guidance, support, help, etc. It's almost like God, Jesus, the pantheon has basically replaced them in that role. In other places, there isn't that same sense that you're supposed to, that they might be able to give you that direct guidance. They might be able to revere, or you're supposed to have a non-conditional relationship or whatever it is. So I'm also struck by the specific form that Christianity has kind of taken in West Africa. I think one of the myths around this period and around this religion is that it was, yes, there was an aspect when Europeans, specifically the British and British missionaries introduced Christianity, of its civilizing the peoples, the peoples in in Akan or wherever it was, but there was also, I think that kind of, and people adopting, but I think also one thing that isn't really looked at is why people decided to adopt it as well. Why did they adopt Christianity? Because it wasn't only a forced conversion. There was also something in it for us, whether it was genuine faith, whether it was maintaining closer trade relationships, whatever it was. And I think that's an element that isn't looked at as much. The thing that tends to get focused on is that the British came, and it was part of a civilizing mission as well. And I think another thing hasn't been looked at specifically is the impacts that had on to an extent on African societies. It may be not as pervasive as one would think, given the combination with the traditional beliefs and practices, but it is something that especially I know in Ghana figures so much in I would say contemporary Ghanaian culture, and the way in which what people believe, their value systems, how they act and behave as well. So it's a fascinating history which I actually don't think has been explored fully, and I think there's a lot of potential there and a lot of scope there to look at other elements of that specific period.
Okay, thank you. So, unfortunately, we're coming to a close. I would like Luke to end this by answering two questions in rapid succession. First, Luke, how do you wish this book to be received? And secondly, what's next on the horizon? What are you working on?
Thank you. Well, my main hope, I think, is that there is that it interests, that it inspires. When people read it, they come away with, I think, a broader sense of African culture, African identity, African history. They're introduced to parts of African history and African culture and identity that hopefully they've never seen before, or not been exposed before, or else that they only knew a little bit about, and that it inspires them to look further, to consider some of the references and some of the sources that I've looked at, and to dig a little bit deeper for themselves as well, and also hopefully to get an idea of what almost a combined history can look like, a history from an African perspective, but that is also inspired by West approaches and Western tools, and how that works in this story, in this narrative. Next, sort of related to that, that lady who very kindly asked me the question about focusing on one element, I want to look more specifically into the achievements of medieval Africa specifically. It seemed to be a period where there were just all across the continent these great societies, great empires who were doing some astonishing things. So I'd like to look at how and why that comes about a little bit more. Yes, again, hopefully that's a story, an inspirational story for people.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Luke. Thank you so much, every single one of you who've been here. Like I mentioned earlier, if you want a copy of this book, there are copies out there at the Vidya stand, or you could visit the Vidya bookstore at Laboni or Osu. You could also get it online on Amazon.com, or if you'd rather maintain your oral traditions, you can get a copy on Audible, narrated by the author himself. So Luke, thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this with us. And thank you everyone for participating so actively in this conversation. The book again is Motherland, A Journey Through 500,000 Years of African Culture and Identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.